All right, so we're just talking about the pharmaceuticals rule here, and this rule is for healthcare facilities as well as retailers of pharmaceuticals. It does include retailers of electronic nicotine distribution systems or electronic cigarettes. We will get much more into the detail, but just a disclaimer for those of you who don't handle pharmaceuticals and don't handle electronic nicotine distribution systems, this rule probably is not going to really apply to you. So you're perfectly welcome to stay and listen, but it's not for everybody. So the goals of this rule are to improve the management and disposal of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities, to decrease the burden for healthcare facility staff of making hazardous waste determinations, because there's a wide variety of different pharmaceuticals, and some of them are hazardous and some of them are not, and some of them are DEA controlled, and it's just a lot of work, and the entire RCRA regulatory system was not really designed for this. It was designed for like an industrial manufacturing situation where they have 5 or 10 different kinds of waste that they're dealing with that are really a known quantity that don't change a lot. And so this just created a much higher burden than intended. And so EPA is working to fix that. And the state of Hawaii has followed along with EPA, just adopted this rule. So this is to allow healthcare personnel to focus on providing healthcare, which we all appreciate. And then of course, also to ensure that hazardous waste is still directed to proper management. So creating a streamlined system for that, but making sure that it's still not ending up in our landfills or in our water. So also to decrease the regulatory burden that comes from becoming an LQG only because of the P-listed pharmaceutical wastes and sometimes even their residues. So I'm sure some of you who are listening out there right now are very, very aware of this particular problem. Maybe you already have an inkling that your generator status is actually going to change lower because of this rule, and you're doing a happy dance about that. Also, we're going to improve the management and disposal of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities by having this streamlined system. The ways that this happens are to decrease the burden of managing those DEA controlled substances that are also a RCRA hazardous waste, and then also encouraging over management of pharmaceuticals that are not legally defined as a hazardous waste by making it easier to manage them as hazardous waste. We want to encourage just manage them all as if they were hazardous, because the actual hazard or danger that's posed by a pharmaceutical may not line up with whether it is legally a hazardous waste. So the last couple ones, reducing sewer disposal, and this is to reduce the active pharmaceuticals in the water supply, and to clarify the regulatory status of reverse distribution. I'm just gonna quick check the chat, and I'm not sure if that will appear on your screen, but I wanna make sure we're not having problems, technical problems. Okay, somebody's put a question into the chat. If you could put your questions into the Q&A, that would be very helpful. But this question is, does this apply to waste pharmaceuticals from veterinary laboratories? And the answer is, it depends. Laboratories generally no, but if it is part of a healthcare facility that is a veterinary healthcare facility, then yes. So we're gonna go very much more into the definition of healthcare facility, so sit tight. Okay, so there's four main parts to this rule. Number one is the sewer ban. And we're going to go over some of these fairly quickly so that we can really focus in. There's also a change to the listing for P075 for nicotine. A change in the definition of an empty container as that pertains to pharmaceuticals. And then the main chunk of what this rule is a new subpart. So it's 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 266, Subpart P, and it's management standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So these four things sort of happen independently of each other. And they also have different applicability and effective dates. So I'm gonna start with that. And by the way, this is being recorded. I plan to post the recording. I also plan to post selected slides, and this is one of them. So don't worry about trying to write all of this down. So the sewer ban is for all healthcare facilities and reverse distributors of pharmaceuticals. It became effective on August 21st, 2019. So you may have already heard me talk about this. This was the only part of the rule that became effective in Hawaii on the federal effective date of August 21st, 2019. And so this is just, you know, don't dump any pharmaceuticals down the sewer. The ban is actually for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, but I really encourage you not to dump anything down the drain except for like saline. So the second part, P075 listing amendment, this applies to all generators of this waste because it just applies to the waste. So we had talked about this last year, and this is already in effect. So the last time we did rules, the effective date, June 25, 2020, we adopted this change to the listing for P075. And it's to remove the over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapy, gums, patches, and lozenges from the listing so that those are no longer a hazardous waste. The empty container definition also applies to all generators, but just became effective now as part of this new rule adoption. So the effective date is June 7th, 2021. And we'll go over that briefly. As I said before, the big chunk of it, and this is only applying to healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, is this new subpart P set of management standards for pharmaceuticals. So it's also going to apply in the state of Hawaii. We've changed the definition of healthcare facility and a pharmaceutical. So these are not including your retailers of electronic nicotine distribution systems, but this is also going to apply to them. Starting June 7th, 2021. So just a reminder, this is not really a substitute for reading the rule. I've read it a few times. The preamble is quite long. The rule is quite complicated. So please think of this as an introduction and not the be all end all of what you're going to want to learn and understand about this particular rule. Okay. So we're going to focus, we're not going to focus, first of all, on the requirements for reverse distributors, because I don't believe we have any within the state of Hawaii. We're not going to focus on electronic nicotine delivery systems. But if that's your world, just know that when we talk about pharmaceuticals, the ones that are going straight to disposal those standards are the same standards that are going to apply to ends. Yeah, so we're not focusing on that. And we're not focusing on this listing amendment for P075 or the reverse logistics policy, which is another thing that's in this rule that's like a separate, it's just something that EPA sort of codified in the preamble to this rule, but it's not actually about this rule. I'm going to go over it really briefly, but we're not focusing on it. What we are going to focus on are the new definitions how to determine your generator status as a healthcare facility, how to determine whether Subpart P applies to you or not, and what the requirements are under Subpart P, and what the options are for a VSQG that is also a healthcare facility. So this is going to be the bulk of our time. But before we get to this, I'm going to go over all the things that I just want to touch on quickly. Okay, so bear with me. We're doing it in this order just because the other stuff is short, and then this stuff that we're focusing on is pretty long. So we'll get back to all these things. The sewer ban, again, already became effective in 2019. You can't put things down the drain if they're hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and you're a healthcare facility or a reverse distributor. It applies to all healthcare facilities, including VSQGs. So it's everybody. And I already said this, EPA and DOH discourage sewering of any pharmaceuticals by any entity. So even if this rule doesn't apply, we strongly discourage dumping any pharmaceuticals down the drain. And I'm just going to quick show you this list of reasons why you should not dump them down the drain. And a big one is that our publicly owned treatment works are not really designed to remove pharmaceuticals. These compounds are intrinsically bioactive, they're resistant to metabolic transformation, and they're being found in water everywhere. So this is just a big up and coming problem, and we don't want to contribute to it. So please do not dump things down the drain. Okay, so second short thing, the empty container definition. So this is one that you're going to want to like print out and have next to you if it changes the world for you, if you're dealing with a lot of pharmaceutical containers. So when you still have residue in a container, but that container meets this legal definition of empty, then it's not regulated as a hazardous waste. So there are 4 different standards for different types of containers that are found in healthcare settings. So you have stock dispensing and unit dose containers, syringes, IV bags, and then all others. And all others is going to include things like aerosol, like nebulizers, inhalers type of stuff. But it also would include like a tube of cream or ointment. There's a lot of different kinds of containers that could fall under that. And then just the sort of headline is there's no more triple rinsing to try to make your container that once held a P-listed waste empty. So this is the slide I was saying, this is the one to print. So I will definitely include this one on the selected slides that I will put up a PDF of when I post this recording. So basically, big change for a stock or dispensing bottle, which is up to 1 liter of liquid or up to 10,000 pills. And also for a unit dose container, like, you know, maybe a little paper cup that you're using to give meds to a patient. Those are going to be considered RCRA empty, just if you remove the contents in the normal way. So even for an acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, you get all of the pills out of that container, it's empty. So that's a big change. Lots of people are very excited about. Hopefully it's good for you. Syringes also have the same standard for acute and non-acute, and that's to fully depress the plunger. And so, you know, whether the plunger has been fully depressed when you are administering a medication or not, that plunger needs to be fully depressed before that syringe is considered empty. So this is an issue in terms of managing sharps, because you really don't want to autoclave a syringe that still has some hazardous waste pharmaceutical in it. That's not safe for the workers who are running that autoclave. Okay, so IV bags, you want to fully administer the contents. And then if it's a non-acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical, it can also meet the definition of empty by following 261.7B1. We're not going to get completely into the weeds here. Other containers can meet 261.7B1 or 2 if it was a non-acute pharmaceutical. And then if it was an acute pharmaceutical, that container can never be empty. There's nothing you can do to make it empty. You're just going to manage it as a hazardous waste if it had an acute hazardous waste pharmaceutical in it. So, you know, EPA is just drawing some bright lines here, but I think they're doing it in a really reasonable way. Hopefully this is going to make things better. Okay, and the third thing I want to briefly talk about is reverse distribution and reverse logistics. So these are defined in the rule as two different things. We're not going to talk a huge amount about reverse distributors themselves, but the reverse logistics policy is a new thing that was part of the retail strategy from 2016. It includes non-prescription pharmaceuticals, but it also includes like any other kind of consumer product that's going through reverse logistics. So yeah, this is an EPA policy on the regulatory status of unsold retail items. This does not include prescription pharmaceuticals, and we are going to get much more into the detail of that. But basically, for prescription pharmaceutical, oh, I'm missing an M here. Sorry about that. Those are definitely going straight to the trash, essentially. They have to go to a hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility. If they're not creditable, there's nowhere else they can go. We'll get into creditable, non-creditable, but just, you know, these are going for disposal. And the only other places they can go are places they shouldn't go, right? And then you have your potentially creditable pharmaceuticals. Those are going to be managed through reverse distribution, but they're also going to go in the end for disposal to that hazardous waste TSDF. And this is very different from what happens with the non-prescription pharmaceuticals and retail items, which EPA is calling reverse logistics. So if there is no reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation, then they're going to the trash. But if there is a reasonable expectation of use, reuse, or reclamation, there are lots of other options for where they can go. They're not all ending up at disposal. And so that's the main difference between the reverse distribution and reverse logistics, is that reverse distribution is handling something that is definitely going to be disposed of anyway. And we already know that as it's going through that reverse distribution system. And in reverse logistics, this is where, you know, things can go to secondary markets. And most of them are not actually going to be disposed in the end. Okay, so I know that was already like a lot of information very quickly, but that was just the stuff that I didn't want to focus on, because if we actually tried to cover everything in this rule, we couldn't do it in under 2 hours. So now I'm going to talk about what we're actually here to talk about and focus on, which is the management standards for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals for healthcare facilities. Okay, so we're gonna start with definitions and then applicability. And then we're gonna talk about those standards. So this is like an outline for the rest of the presentation. We're gonna talk about VSQG healthcare facilities, some options that VSQGs have, and then a couple of conditional exemptions that are new to this rule. So definitions and applicability. The main definition that everything is based on is the definition pharmaceutical. And then your healthcare facilities are the generators of that pharmaceutical hazardous waste that this new management system is set up for. A reverse distributor is a new type of RCRA regulated entity because it's not a TSDF or a treatment, storage, and disposal facility for hazardous waste. And so this whole rule is about creating a system under which you can send your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are potentially creditable to a reverse distributor who can then send them to a TSDF and without any of that sort of being outside of the RCRA regulations. Okay. So pharmaceutical is any drug or dietary supplement for use by humans or other animals. And then in the federal rule, it also includes electronic nicotine delivery systems and e-liquids, but in the Hawaii rule, it does not include these things. We have created a separate definition for those. So pharmaceutical includes all of these things, and it excludes all of these things. So it does not include dental amalgam, sharps, and medical waste. Okay. So there are also some pharmaceuticals not subject to regulation. And this is where definitions and applicability get kind of intertwined. So the ones that are not regulated are if there is a reasonable expectation that it can be legitimately used, reused, or reclaimed. And that's primarily going to apply to a non-prescription pharmaceutical. If it's recalled under a preservation order or in some kind of judicial proceeding, if it's an investigational new drug, and then also if it's generated in a household, then these rules don't apply. The ones that are recalled under some kind of judicial or investigation situation, like their evidence and they're being held, or if it's an investigational new drug, they do become subject to regulation when the decision is made to discard them. But that typically doesn't happen at the generator site, at the healthcare facility. It happens later on. So under healthcare facilities, there are some other definitions like long-term care facility that get really specific. If that applies to you, you definitely want to go read it. And then we already talked about reverse distributor. So a healthcare facility is any person, and person of course does not mean human. It means like any company or entity, legal entity. Any person that is lawfully authorized to provide preventative, diagnostic, therapeutic, rehabilitative, maintenance, or palliative care and counseling service assessment or procedure with respect to the physical or mental condition or functional status of a human or animal, or that affects the structure or function of the human or animal body. So it's quite broad. It's like any kind of healthcare and being provided to humans or animals. And then a healthcare facility is also, see that or at the end, or a person who is distributing, selling, or dispensing pharmaceuticals, including over-the-counter pharmaceuticals, dietary supplements, homeopathic drugs, or prescription pharmaceuticals. So again, it's very broad, But most of what we're talking about here in terms of the standards under subpart P do only apply to healthcare facilities. So if you're some other kind of entity handling pharmaceuticals, then these rules don't apply to you. So here is a list of examples of things that are included and not included in healthcare facility. Oh, and I need to fix on my slide where it says retailers of pharmaceuticals includes vape shops, because in the Hawaii rule, those have a separate category, which is a retailer of electronic nicotine distribution systems. They're going to follow the same rules, but we don't want to call them a healthcare facility. I'm sure you can understand why. But, you know, the way that EPA works and the way that some of the other states work, their hazardous waste program is not under the Department of Health. And so they don't have the same kind of heartburn that we have about calling those things healthcare facilities. The definition of long-term care facility is sort of complicated, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But if this applies to you, we should talk and make sure that you have a clear understanding of it. A long-term care facility with 20 beds or fewer is presumed to be a very small quantity generator. And also long-term care facilities cannot use the household hazardous waste exclusion for their hazardous waste anymore. So this is a change in interpretation of how that household hazardous waste exclusion applies. So reverse distributors are going to receive potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and of course, pharmaceuticals that are not hazardous as well, to facilitate or verify manufacturer credit. They can accept only potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So if there's no way it could possibly get credit, then it can't go there. This is what we're going more into detail on. And as I said, it's a new kind of hazardous waste management facility that does not require a RCRA permit. Okay, so under pharmaceuticals, we have hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. We also have non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste. So these are all new definitions within the rule. Some of them seem fairly obvious. Like it's non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste if it's a hazardous waste, but it doesn't meet the definition of a pharmaceutical. But the idea here is that we're targeting a specific part of the waste stream, right? So you have hazardous waste, you have pharmaceuticals. The area that's in overlap, which is the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, is really where this rule is focused. And then that gets broken down more. So within that, you've got three ways of naming more specific information about this hazardous waste pharmaceutical. So the first one is it's non-creditable. That means it definitely is not going to get manufacturer credit, and we don't need to send it through reverse distribution because we already know there's no credit. We can just throw it out, and that means it's going to a permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility for hazardous waste straight away. The second one is it's potentially creditable. So that's a hazardous waste pharmaceutical that does need to go through reverse distribution in order to find out whether you're getting manufacturer credit or not. And then the third definition name that we have is evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceutical. Those are the same ones as the potentially creditable ones. They just change from being potentially creditable to being already evaluated once the reverse distributor decides whether or not credit will be issued. But they're actually the same pharmaceutical. They're just at a different stage in that process. So we're not really going to worry about evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals because those only exist at the reverse distributor, and the reverse distributor is going to send them to RCRA permitted TSDF. So we're focusing on the generator side, on the healthcare facility side, and we're really just going to be looking at the non-creditable and potentially creditable here. So don't freak out, but I made another version of that Venn diagram to try to explain this. And this is another one to like print out and just stare at until it starts to make sense. So you have within hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, prescription and non-prescription. And in the prescription area, let's see, I have my little pointer here. You have potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that become evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. If it's a hazardous waste, it might be creditable, right? And then still within the prescription side, because the red line is the dividing line between prescription and non-prescription, you have this area here that are going to be non-creditable. And then within the non-prescription, you also have some that are going to be non-creditable. That's this chunk here. Okay. The reason I made this is because I have one other slide that sort of expands on this that will come back later. If this doesn't help you, just don't worry about it. Just ignore it. But if your brain works a little bit like mine, I'm not going to say if it works like mine because it probably doesn't. This may be helpful to you. So just, you know, take it if it's helpful. I'm going to pause right here before we go into the definitions of non-creditable and potentially creditable, and just take a quick look at the Q&A. So I'm going to stop my screen share. Okay, so somebody's asking if the other containers, such as a container of liquid that once held acute hazardous waste, has to be managed as hazardous waste. Does it need to be managed as a P-listed hazardous waste? So if it is a container of liquid that was like a stock or dispensing bottle less than 1 liter, then once it is emptied by pouring it out, it would meet the definition of empty. The other containers, like a tube of ointment or something like that, would have to be managed as hazardous waste. So there is no difference on how you would manage it as a P-listed waste. You're thinking of how it would affect your generator category, probably. And that's sort of a different question. So we will be getting to that. But yes, the way that you're counting wastes for your generator category is also changed by this rule. So pharmaceutical hazardous waste that you are managing under subpart P, quote unquote, don't count toward your generator category, but don't check out just yet, because you actually have to count them first to figure out your generator category, including that waste, to determine whether you're subject to subpart P. So we are going to talk much more about how to determine your generator category. Okay, another question, would the Waikiki Aquarium, which uses pharmaceuticals to treat their animals, fall under these rules? I believe the answer is yes, because they're essentially functioning as a veterinary clinic there. I mean, if that is true, then they would. Who decides whether something is potentially creditable? That is a good question, and that is where we're going now. So the reason it says potentially creditable is because you don't decide whether it's creditable. You just know that it might be. Okay, so we're gonna go back to the slides and we're gonna delve into what is creditable and non-creditable. So a non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceutical is if the pharmaceutical has been dispensed to a patient, the packaging is broken or leaking, it's been repackaged, it's more than 1 year expired, it's an investigational new drug, it's a free sample, a residue, a floor sweeping, or if you have PPE that's like grossly contaminated with pharmaceuticals, that also falls under the definition of pharmaceutical. It's definitely going to be non-creditable. And also spill cleanup material. So these are things that you cannot send to a reverse distributor because there's no possibility of them receiving manufacturer credit based on their expiration or how they're packaged or what they are. So those things are just going to go straight to a TSDF. That's sort of as simple as it gets, right? There's nowhere else for it to go. It's definitely trash. Potentially creditable are going to be in their original manufacturer packaging, unless they're recalled, and then that's another story. But that's sort of the exception. They're going to be undispensed and they're going to be unexpired or less than 1 year expired. So it's really like anything that doesn't fit these 3 points is non-creditable. But if it does meet this description of all 3 of these points, it's potentially creditable. And that's as far as you have to go in making that determination as the healthcare facility who's generating this pharmaceutical waste. And that's kind of the whole point, is you don't really know whether it's going to receive credit or not because the rules are always changing, but it could possibly receive credit. And so those that are potentially creditable are going to go to the reverse distributor. And in some cases, the reverse distributor is going to send them to another reverse distributor. Maybe that second reverse distributor is the manufacturer, or they're contracted with the manufacturer. And then the evaluated pharmaceuticals, like we talked about, is once they've already issued credit or they know that they're not eligible for credit, those are going from the reverse distributor to the TSDF. But again, those are the exact same pharmaceuticals that were called potentially creditable at the point they left the healthcare facility. And so we're only going to focus on these 2 flows of non-creditable from the healthcare facility to the TSDF, and potentially creditable from the healthcare facility to the reverse distributor. Because if you're the healthcare facility, this is really what you need to worry about and understand. Okay, so determining your generator status to see if this applies to you. Just briefly, when you make a hazardous waste determination, the steps you go through: is it a solid waste? Can it be used, reused? So the non-prescription ones typically have a possibility to be used or reused, and that's why they can go through reverse logistics. And most of what we're talking about here is prescription pharmaceuticals that definitely can't be used, reused. So if it can be used again or reused, then it might not be a waste to begin with. It might not be a solid waste, so it can't be a hazardous waste. So that's sort of one place where some of the pharmaceuticals will fall out and will not be hazardous waste, is because they're not actually waste yet. And then you'll ask, is it a listed commercial chemical product? So that's your PNU list. And so you know if it's a chemical on those lists that is the sole active ingredient for that pharmaceutical, then it will be a hazardous waste pharmaceutical. And then if it's not on those lists, you'll ask, is it a characteristic hazardous waste, right? And then you have these characteristics. And here's a little chart. So this process of making a hazardous waste determination takes a lot of time and energy. And a big part of the point of this rule is to not have to do this for each pharmaceutical that you're generating. So I'm just sort of going through it to remind you and illustrate what that work is that you would have to do. And then here's a list of some of the common hazardous waste. I mean, this is not a complete list at all, but you have P listed, you have U listed, you have things that are D001, a couple of things that are D002. I saw a list, but then I couldn't find them when I was putting these slides together. So there's just a lot of different chemicals, right? And then determining your applicability of subpart P, first, you've got to count everything, right? So this is going to include your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And within your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, that means you're also including the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So the ones that are being sent to a reverse distributor that are hazardous waste would count. So this is a change in EPA's position. I believe that Department of Health had already taken this position before this rule came out, to say that the pharmaceuticals that are sent for reverse distribution are already a waste at the point of generation, the healthcare facility. That is where we know they're ultimately going to be disposed of when you're sending them to the reverse distributor. They're not going to be reused. So this is, again, mainly the prescription ones. And then you also include all of your non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste. If you include all of your hazardous waste, you include all of your universal waste, which is a subcategory of hazardous waste. So this is really counting all of your hazardous waste to determine whether this applies to you. So you would come up with what is your generator category if you count everything, and that will tell you whether it applies. So if you're generating more than 100 kilograms per month, which is 220 pounds per month of hazardous waste, or greater than 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds per month of acute hazardous waste, then you would be subject to subpart P. And then once you know you're subject to subpart P or not, you would count only the hazardous waste that's subject to regular, like full regulation under Chapter 11-262.1. So this would not include your universal waste, and it would not include your pharmaceuticals. And so this is where, once you don't count those, your generator category might go down from LQG to SQG or from LQG to VSQG. So if you count everything and you're a VSQG to begin with, then you already know that's it. You're a VSQG. You don't have to count again, right? You're still going to be a VSQG on the number 2. Oh, I said that. Okay. So the other wrinkle is that you have a lot of non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that we would recommend managing with care, which essentially means you should manage these as if they were a regulated hazardous waste, even if they're not. So pharmaceuticals with more than one active ingredient on the P list or the U list, chemotherapy agents that are characterized as bulk wastes, anything that meets the NIOSH hazardous drug criteria, and then things with an LD50 that is less than 50 milligrams per kilogram, is carcinogenic or endocrine disrupting. I mean, there's just a lot of these, anything with heavy metals in it. And so the idea is to just manage everything as if it was a hazardous waste, because you don't have to count it towards your generator status. And some of it that's going through reverse distribution, you're not going to have to use a uniform hazardous waste manifest. So it's sort of an odd roundabout way that EPA wants to encourage over management, is just to make it that is the easier thing to do, rather than having to make a hazardous waste determination, rather than having to determine your applicability, that you would just act as if these things are all hazardous and the rules apply. So once you determine that you're subject to subpart P, you're regulated the same way, regardless of how much hazardous waste pharmaceuticals you generate. And if you're operating under subpart P, you don't have to track your monthly generation of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, because again, those are not affecting your generator category. And then you also don't have to worry about segregating the acute and the non-acute pharmaceuticals, because that's not affecting your generator category. And if you choose to manage all pharmaceuticals, all waste pharmaceuticals, as if they were hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, then you don't have to make hazardous waste determinations on your individual types of pharmaceuticals, and you don't have to keep documentation of those hazardous waste determinations. So it is optional to do it this way, but it's designed to make it easier to encourage you to do it this way. And then here's that slide that I had shown before about the different kinds of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are regulated, and how I think about this is that we're actually trying to capture things that are outside of hazardous waste pharmaceutical. So the idea is that you will want to regulate some of your non-hazardous waste. You will want to manage some of your non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals the same way that you're going to manage the hazardous waste ones. And so capturing a bigger piece of that pie, and managing them more safely. Like that's essentially, I think, the big picture goal with this rule. And it's something that it has to be optional, because we're talking about how are you managing things that we don't regulate. But if you think back to that list of reasons for the sewer ban, and why is it a good idea to stop dumping pharmaceuticals down the drain, even if they're not regulated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals? The same thing is true about putting them into the landfills. Like it's just best practice to manage more of them as if they were hazardous. So providing an incentive to really overmanage as if they were a hazardous waste. So let's see. I think it's time for a break. Okay. Hopefully everybody's back and still with me. I want to share from the Q&A. Kathleen says in EPA's frequently asked questions page about this rule that they're allowing over-the-counter pharmaceuticals to go to a reverse distributor as well as to a reverse logistics provider under certain circumstances. And that makes sense because ultimately, if it's going to a reverse distributor, the only place that it's going from there is disposal, and it's going to permitted hazardous waste TSDF. So that's always going to be perfectly fine to sort of overmanage things where you have an option to do something else with them, as if they were a hazardous waste. So I think that makes perfect sense. So, standards for healthcare facilities. The first requirement that you definitely should know about if you are a healthcare facility is that you need to submit a notification to me by August 6th, 2021. So this is within 60 days of the effective date. So since the effective date of this rule became June 7th, the deadline became August 6th to submit this notification. So I actually think I still need to go on to RCRA info and change the little checkbox to opt in before you can have that thing to click on. So I'm gonna write myself a note right now to do that today. If you don't have an account in the RCRA Info Industry app, I strongly encourage you to get one so that you can submit your notification online. If anybody does not have our website bookmarked, you can put in the Q&A and remind me that I need to show this at the end about how you could submit the notification form online. But it's the same form as EPA form 8700-12 that people have been submitting on paper for a long time. And so if you do it online, it's going to pre-fill your information, and then you just have to go find the slider button for "Are you a healthcare facility?" change it to yes, and then fill in the information it asks for. So it's a pretty easy thing to do, but it is a requirement. So don't wait and call me if you have questions on how to do this. Another requirement, and again, these are for all healthcare facilities, regardless of what your generator status is going to be after you stop counting those pharmaceuticals, these requirements are the same. So the employee training is sort of an SQG-like performance standard. It's not like a big thing, but you do have to make sure that the employees who are handling hazardous waste pharmaceuticals know about this rule and about how they're supposed to be managing them. Hazardous waste determinations, which, like we talked about, if you manage everything as a hazardous waste, then you don't have to make hazardous waste determinations, but otherwise you do. And then reporting and record keeping. And so these are very similar to what those requirements are under 262, or in our Hawaii rules, it's chapter 11-262.1 HAR. It's just that because those rules don't apply to this waste anymore, they had to kind of put the same thing so that it still applies. So 3 years of your manifests and your hazardous waste determination records and all these things. And then also exception reporting, which is if you're shipping something off and you don't get confirmation that it was received, and this is within 60 days for subpart P. And also spill response. So very basic requirements, nothing crazy. And then you have the accumulation requirements for non-creditable pharmaceuticals. So they just have to be labeled hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So the easiest way to do that is you have, an outer container that you're going to accumulate all of the little containers in, and just have that outer container labeled hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And then the container, of course, has to be all of the things that a container usually has to be in RCRA: structurally sound, compatible with the contents, lacking evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage. And then there are some requirements for ignitable and reactive waste. Like, it's basically the same requirements that were under 262 to make sure that these things are being accumulated safely. The container has to be closed. It also has to be secured in a manner that prevents unauthorized access. So this is a different requirement that I would just flag as this is specific to pharmaceuticals because they're worried about diversion. So that is something a little bit different, but it can just be that, like, it's in a locked room. It doesn't have to be fancy. And then the maximum accumulation time is 1 year. So this is part of the relief that this provides. So these standards overall are sort of universal waste like. I know some of you are already thinking this because you also handle universal wastes, right? So 1 year. And you do have options about how to track that accumulation. The easiest one, I think, is just to put the accumulation start date on the container. But you could also have an inventory system that tracks that, or you could have a specific accumulation area rather than a container that's labeled with the earliest accumulation start date for any container in that area. So you have some options there. You do have to segregate the non-combustible wastes. So these are metal bearing wastes that cannot be combusted because that would constitute dilution. And these have to be labeled with the hazardous waste codes. So the only ones that I have found in any of the documentation on this rule are these. So it's a few specific chemicals and then anything containing this list of metals. And so rather than trying to worry about making a hazardous waste determination on everything, you know, just worry about segregating these is kind of the upshot. And then liquids and aerosols do need to have some kind of outer container, but it can just be a sealed plastic bag. And this is to reduce the risk of spills and releases. So those were the standards for the non-creditable hazardous waste farms. So for on-site accumulation, you have labeling, container standards, a maximum accumulation time, and then you do have to make a hazardous waste determination unless you're just going to manage everything as a hazardous waste. And then for potentially creditable hazardous waste farms, there are no labeling, container standards, maximum accumulation requirements. And the reason for that is because these things are going to already be in their original packaging. And they're only going to be potentially creditable if they're unexpired or less than 1 year expired. And so you already have, you know, a label that tells you what it is and a time limit on it being potentially creditable. And so there's no need for us to impose more rules. And so, you know, to me, this is like a really great, like this is EPA being super reasonable. And so we're happy to sort of fall in line with that. You know, and hopefully it's going to make your life easier. So now talking about shipping. So the non-creditable pharmaceuticals, again, are going straight to a permitted RCRA treatment, storage, and disposal facility. You're going to use a hazardous waste transporter and a hazardous waste manifest. So there's no change there, but the relief is that you don't have to put all of the waste codes on the manifest. You can put PHARMS, or I guess you have to put PHARMS or PHRM in that box 13 on the manifest instead of all the different waste codes. But then for the metal bearing wastes that cannot be combusted, those are going to be separate, right? So they'll be on a separate line on the manifest. And for those, you're going to have the hazardous waste codes. And then you just keep your copies of your manifests for 3 years. So just as an aside, very soon, next week on June 30th, the e-manifest system will be 3 years old. And that means that if you register for an account and you can see your site's manifests on there because all of the TSDFs have been submitting their manifests for 3 years. You won't have to keep your paper copies once they're uploaded by the TSDF. You can use that as your copy of record. So one of these days, very soon, I'm going to do another webinar about the RCRA Info Industry app and the eManifest system. But I just want to encourage you to think about signing up and using that so that you can stop keeping 3 years of paper copies. Okay, and then the second option is you have your potentially creditable pharmaceuticals, you're sending them to the reverse distributor. So in order to ship these, you do not need to use a uniform hazardous waste manifest, and you do not need to use a hazardous waste transporter. The shipper, that's you, the healthcare facility, must receive a delivery confirmation from the reverse distributor. But that can just be like a thing that the Postal Service or UPS or FedEx or whoever has as a delivery confirmation, like, you know, requires signature upon receipt, and then you get like an email that says, you know, this person signed for it, it was received on this day, that's it. And then if you don't get that confirmation receipt within 35 days, then that's an issue. And then that's where you have to like try to figure out what happened to it. Oh, and I said electronic delivery confirmation is fine. You do also have to keep these records for 3 years. So when you are shipping things to a reverse distributor, that is going to be out of state. And so I just want to kind of give you a little reminder / caveat. This is EPA's map off of their website about where the rule has been adopted. I need to get them to update this map for, you know, the fact that we've adopted the rule, and, you know, maybe they've updated it since I made these slides a week or 2 ago. But not every place has this rule. And so if you're gonna, you know, so this us, we adopted it, yay. If you're gonna send your waste, it's gonna transit through or be received in a state that has not adopted the rule, then there might be some issues with not using the hazardous waste codes on a manifest for your non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are going to a TSDF, because the receiving state could be requiring all of those codes still if they haven't adopted the rule. And then also when you're sending to a reverse distributor, there could be an issue with not using a manifest to send that. And so there's still like, we're in the process, you know, we're working on it. And so you have to check out like, what is the status of your receiving state, and also maybe states that it has to transit through. So I know that a lot of folks are shipping to TSDFs that are in Washington state, which has adopted the rule. And then they're like bulking the waste and sending it on. So, you know, possibly that could be helpful because since they've adopted the rule, you should be able to like send to a TSDF without having to write all the waste codes on the manifest. If you're sending to the state of Washington, for instance. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that in another couple of years, this map is going to look really different. Okay, so moving on to the VSQG healthcare facilities. I just want to pause here and say, wow, that part about how to actually manage the waste is shorter than I thought it would be, because the bulk of this rule is really like, what are the definitions? What is the applicability? Like trying to understand all these new terms. But once you kind of get that, it's really just potentially creditable versus non-creditable pharmaceuticals. That's the big distinction. And then you have your like metal bearing ones that can't be incinerated that you need to segregate. It's actually, the management standards are fairly simple. So I expect that maybe a lot of the folks on this call are like the person who's going to have to explain this then to everyone else about like, how are we changing what the bins are to put the waste into? So, you know, what you're going to be telling them is actually fairly simple. But it's important for you to understand why that is, I guess. So, yeah, just call me if you want to talk about it more, because I know it seems really complicated and then it seems really simple and it's like, wait, did I miss something? But I don't think you did. It's just that they had to make all of these new definitions in order to create a new management system. They had to like name things, but the management standards are actually pretty simple. So, okay, for VSQG healthcare facilities. So if you count all of your hazardous waste, both your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and your non-pharmaceutical hazardous waste, and you're still a VSQG, counting all of that, then you are like a quote unquote true VSQG. Then you have some options because you don't have to follow subpart P. It is optional for you, except for the sewer ban, which you do have to follow. That's for everyone. Okay, so, and oh, one more thing on this. This includes counting your potentially creditable pharmaceuticals that you would send to a reverse distributor, because those are hazardous waste. So you have to count those also. But if you're still a VSQG, then you have options. So you would remain under 40 CFR 62.14 as it is incorporated and amended in Chapter 11-262.1 Hawaii Administrative Rules, which we call 262.14 for short. Which means that you have different options about where to send your waste, right? So you're subject to subpart P for the sewer prohibition, for the empty container definitions, which just applies to everybody, even if you're not a healthcare facility, right? And then there are some optional provisions in 266.504. And so you can opt in essentially. You can send potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a reverse distributor. You can also send hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a healthcare facility under the control of the same person who's going to consolidate them. So remember, person again means company. But if you are a VSQG that is a long-term care facility, you can dispose of your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in an on-site collection receptacle that complies with DEA regulations, except for your DEA controlled substances. That's a really weird one. And when I was putting these slides together, I understood it, but I already don't understand that. I have to read it again. So that only applies to you if you're a long-term care facility. Yeah. So if you are, call me. So using these options is different from opting in to subpart P. So these are just the things you can do as a VSQG who's not under subpart P. The other thing you can do is opt in, but first we're going to talk about consolidation. So the second bullet, you can send your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a healthcare facility under the control of the same person. The receiving facility either has to be under the control of the same person, or they have to supply the VSQG with their pharmaceuticals. So I guess there are some situations where There's like a contract with a pharmacy. I don't really know all of the details of how that works in the real world, but it could be a separate company, but it's supplying all of the pharmaceuticals to that VSQG. So that VSQG would be able to send them back. And then the receiving facility would also have to be operating under Subpart P and manage those received pharmaceuticals that come from the VSQG under Subpart P. So they would manage them the same way they're managing their own. So I believe that it is possible for like 2 VSQGs to consolidate this way, but one of them would have to opt in and be operating under Subpart P as the receiver. And then the other one would not opt in and would just be sending theirs for consolidation. And the receiver also has to keep records of shipments for 3 years. So those of you who are super into the rules, you rule nerds out there, which is maybe nobody on this call, may know that there's this other VSQG consolidation thing that we've been talking about for the past few years under the generator improvements rule. And so this slide is just showing the comparison. Because if you're a VSQG healthcare facility, and you're under 262.14, you do still have this other option about how to send your waste for consolidation. And you can use that. So you have these 2 different options about consolidating your waste, and they just have different requirements, essentially. So if you want to talk about that, call me. Okay, so a VSQG who actually wants to opt in, and why would you do this, is so that you don't have to keep making hazardous waste determinations and counting all of your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and figuring out whether you are still an SQG. So you would have to submit a notification saying that you're opting in. And if you decide at some later point that you want to opt out, you would have to submit another notification that you're going to opt out. Those are also on the regular notification form. If you opt in, then you have to comply with all of Subpart P. And if you do that, then you cannot use the optional provisions, which means you cannot do the Subpart P consolidation, because you then have to manage your own pharmaceuticals that you've generated under Subpart P. You would still have to keep track of your monthly generation amounts for your non-pharmaceutical waste to see if you're still a VSQG for your generator status outside of Subpart P, but you wouldn't have to be keeping track of how much pharmaceuticals you're generating because it wouldn't matter, right? Like once you're in Subpart P, there are no generator statuses in there. You're just going to manage it under the one set of standards for Subpart P. Does that make sense? It's kind of confusing, I know. But the idea is you would opt in order to save you from having to make the hazardous waste determinations and to be counting the pharmaceutical waste that you're generating. So it could be of a benefit. It just kind of depends on your situation. Okay, so just a little bit of a review on the standards for healthcare facilities. So I'm gonna leave this up for a minute, and this is another one where I think it's good to just soak it in for a while. So we have potentially creditable. Let me get my little laser pointer here again. We have now my mouse stopped working. Oh, there we go. Potentially credible and non-creditable. And I don't know why this bar didn't go all the way across. I should probably fix that. But okay, so for on-site accumulation for your potentially creditable, there's no standards, there's no time limit. And then for non-creditable, for your on-site accumulation, you have universal waste-like standards, right? They just have to be labeled hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. You can accumulate for a year. There are different options for how you track that, but I recommend just putting that accumulation start date on the container. I think it's the easiest. For potentially creditable shipping, you're shipping to a reverse distributor. You need delivery confirmation. You can use a common carrier, right? So these are like really minimal requirements for the potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. You just have to keep track of them, essentially. You know, we have to make sure that they went to a reverse distributor. And then for the non-creditable, you're going to be shipping to a RCRA permitted TSDF, and you're going to use a manifest with the code PHARMS or PHRM on the manifest instead of all the waste codes. And then you have to use a hazardous waste transporter. So again, it's actually pretty simple once you arrive there. Okay, so a couple of conditional exemptions to talk about here. So hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are also DEA controlled substances. Essentially, you're going to manage them under DEA's regulations. And as long as they're disposed of in accordance with DEA regulations, which means they're going to be incinerated, and there's a list of types of incinerators they can go to. Or if DEA at some point in the future does issue a written determination that some other form of disposal meets their non-retrievable standard, then you can do that. But a note on this, which is that there are products out there that claim that they meet DEA's non-retrievable standard. None of them actually do. DEA has never issued a written determination saying, you know, this product meets our non-retrievable standard. So as of right now, the only way to do that is to incinerate your pharmaceuticals. But anyway, to follow the DEA rules, and then if you do, they're conditionally exempt from regulation as hazardous waste. So that just makes it easier to get rid of your DEA controlled substances that were previously dual regulated. Oh, and actually, I have specifically in my notes here, Cactus Sink and RX Destroyer on this next slide. They make the claim of non-retrievable, but they do not have a written determination from DEA. Right, so these are the conditions for this exemption. I forgot that this was on two separate slides. So you have to collect, store, and transport these things in compliance with DEA requirements. You cannot put them down the sewer. And this is the list of different kinds of combustors or incinerators. I think we've reached the end. That took me by surprise a little bit. So now we have time, plenty of time for Q&A. So keep on putting your questions into the Q&A. I'm going to answer the one that is here. We are an LQG and there are medical facilities on the installation. I believe this is a military site. Okay, there are medical facilities on the installation and a separate central accumulation area. If hazardous waste pharmaceuticals go to the central accumulation area, can the CAA just put PHARMS on the hazardous waste manifest when sending out the waste? I'm trying to understand this question. I think you're saying, do the rules for these pharmaceuticals somehow change if we send them to the central accumulation area where all the other hazardous waste is? And the answer is no, the rules stay the same. So if they're still on the same site, like you have a whole military base and it's all one RCRA site, and it has one EPA ID number, then that site is a healthcare facility, and it's going to be subject to Subpart P, and you're going to follow all of these management standards that we just talked about, including that when you send your non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals off to a TSDF on a manifest, you just write PHARMS or PHRM. You don't need all the waste codes, except for those metal-bearing ones that cannot be incinerated. Okay. I do have a couple more slides of resources and reminders. So maybe I will go forward and then come back again, because I don't see any more questions. And I do want to give you time to write more questions. Okay, so somebody says, if we put everything in a black RCRA container and dispose via RCRA hazardous waste stream, no need to track weight except for the metal bearing. When you ship it off, your transporter is still going to weigh it, because that weight goes on the manifest, but you don't need to track weight for your generator status, because you're already just under Subpart P and there's no generator status there. And then you're not going to count those pharmaceuticals towards your generator status. Yep. Okay, so keep on typing your questions. I'm going to go through a couple more resources and reminders slides, and these are ones that I will post because they're all links. So I'm just going to tell you what exists in the world, and then hopefully very soon, within the next week, I will get all of this posted up on the website. So you know that we have a rules page. You already know that exists in the world. And then we have also other pages on our website. I think, yeah, the guidance that I have here, it's a link to our FAQ page for the Department of Health Hazardous Waste Program. So you don't actually have to wait for me to post this to find those. It's health.hawaii.gov/SHWB/haswaste is our homepage. And then you just click on rules, or you click on guidance and FAQs. So all of the new rules and the new guidebooks are posted. Please let me know if you see any errors. I actually found an error in one of the guidebooks yesterday when I was working on the presentation I'm giving next week. So I do need to fix those up a little bit, but they're all there. And then EPA also has a really great website about this rule. There's a link to the rule itself that I put directly here, as well as their frequently asked questions, which are, I mean, just really extensive. So the thing you have to remember when you're looking at EPA's website, or if you want to listen to their webinar about the rule, is just that the difference in the Hawaii rule is that pharmaceuticals does not include electronic nicotine delivery systems. And whenever EPA is talking, it does. So that's that. And then EPA also has some guidance about managing pharmaceuticals that I want to give you a link to. And then there is a thing that exists that is called the Healthcare Environmental Resource Center, or HERC. Oh, there's a random overlap of text here on my slide. I apologize for that. So this is a compliance assistance thing, and it's funded. I don't know if it's fully funded by EPA, but it does receive some funding from EPA through something called the National Compliance Assistance Centers program. So you can Google this Healthcare Environmental Resource Center. They have a lot of very helpful things, including lists of what are common pharmaceuticals that are hazardous wastes. And then guidance for safe disposal of household hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. You just might have a curiosity about this for yourself. And then also some links to the retail strategy and to the reverse logistics policy. And I do see that we had some more questions come in the Q&A, so I will go ahead and answer those. But here's my email address in case you would like to email me. Okay, so somebody says, I came back late a couple minutes from break. Was the August notification to indicate you are following subpart P and or that you have a medical facility? Thank you for asking that. I guess maybe next time I'll make the break longer, huh? So everybody who is a healthcare facility subject to subpart P needs to submit that notification. So the notification is to say, I am a healthcare facility subject to this rule. So the only healthcare facilities that don't have to submit that notification by August 6th are those that are VSQGs when counting all of your waste. And then you have the option. You can opt in and say, I want to participate in subpart P. And then later on, you can also submit a notification to opt out. But this is just a one-time notification. So for everybody who is an SQG or an LQG, when counting all of your waste, even if you're going to drop down. So if you were an LQG, and then if you stop counting your pharmaceutical waste, that would make you a VSQG. You are required to submit the notification. And on the notification, you would say, I am a healthcare facility. And then you would say, I am a VSQG. Does that make sense? I know it's weird and confusing. Okay. Another question, do you have a reference for an approved DEA disposal stream if Cactus and RX Destroyer are not? So my understanding is that there are none, that DEA has not issued any public written determinations to say this product meets our non-retrievable standard. And you know, I've read a lot of information from EPA, and I know they've been working with DEA on this rule. They say there is nothing that has been approved by DEA. The only thing that you can do right now is incineration. And so that's why a few slides back, I will go back so you can see this list again. There are these different types of combustors and incinerators here at the bottom. So it doesn't have to be a hazardous waste combustor in order to meet that that DEA standard. There are wider options, but in order to meet the conditions for the exemption from being regulated as hazardous waste for something that is both a hazardous waste and a DEA controlled substance, it's going to have to be incinerated in one of these 4 types of combustors or incinerators. Question, when might the map of states be updated and where will it be posted on EPA or DOH websites? Great question. So that map showing who has and hasn't adopted the pharmaceuticals rule is on EPA's website. They don't really have a schedule for when they update it. It's like when a state tells them, hey, you really need to update this. So I'm going to tell them that as soon as I remember to do it, but I did just write it down. So hopefully it will be updated shortly, and it will continue to be updated. They have a meeting every month about this rule that's just for like the states who are implementing the hazardous waste program. And so every month they're asking if any states have adopted, and then they're updating it as they can. So I can put a link on the DOH website to EPA's website where the map is. And then, do we know if the hazardous waste transporting companies are in the loop? That is such a great question. I don't have a separate email list for them, but they are on my email list. So hopefully a couple of them are like listening right now. Yeah, they should be in the loop. but I have not done specific outreach to the transporters. I hope that your transporters will know what's going on when they come to pick up your waste. But if they don't, you can certainly send them to watch the recording of this webinar, and tell them to give me a call. Okay, so we have a question about VSQG consolidation. It says maybe we can address via email, but let's see. Based on generator improvement regulations, if a generator of both acute hazardous waste and non-acute hazardous waste in 1 month moves from VSQG to SQG or LQG, then they need to consolidate. I don't think I understand the question. But in general, I can say that your generator status can change from month to month. Part of the idea of the pharmaceuticals rule is that when you're not counting your pharmaceuticals toward generator status anymore because you're just managing them under subpart P, then your generator status won't fluctuate in that way. So the only people who are allowed to send their waste for consolidation under the generator improvement rule are VSQGs. So if your generator status changed to SQG, you wouldn't be able to send that waste off to be consolidated by another site. You would have to manage it as an SQG. But if that doesn't answer your question, yeah, just send me an email. Okay, well, somebody said thank you in the chat, so I appreciate that. Thank you for coming. I will go ahead and let you go, but you can always email or call me if you have more questions that come up. This is just the beginning, and I realize that it's a very long and complicated rule, but it repays rereading, and I think that maybe you'll watch this video again, gather your coworkers together and have a little movie night during the day with popcorn at work, hopefully. Yeah, so have a good day, everybody, and maybe I'll see you next week on the Universal Waste webinar. It's going to be next Wednesday at 9. Okay, thank you so much for coming. Take care, everybody.